last week was the introduction to this new series, THRIVAL. And it's really this conversation about how we may move in our lives from a place of purely surviving into a place of thriving. And we ended last week with this quote by the founder of analytic psychology, Carl Jung. And he says this: "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And how many of us know, or at least have had the sense, that we live in a world that feels like it's becoming increasingly unconscious? How many of us have been to a restaurant recently and we've looked around and maybe we've seen a couple or an entire family all looking at their phones during the meal? Or sometimes it can get even worse. There's a story that just came out of a man who he took Apple's new virtual reality headset called the Vision Pro, and he wore it to his wedding. And if you can tell, the bride does not look too happy about it. In my generation, we call that face the ick. Okay, she got the ick. See, the reality, though, friends, is that in some way or another, we are all that, right? You might not think of it, but we are all kind of being pulled in this direction, and we all have this tendency in one way or another to have things in our lives that pull us out of the present moment. And so in this series, as we talk about moving from surviving into thriving, we're also really talking about moving from an unconscious way of life into a more conscious way of life. Here's the reality: life can be very uncomfortable at times. Life can be very unpredictable. And instead of dealing with the feelings that arise, we tend to distract. We tend to escape. We tend to even avoid. And we tend to choose unconsciousness over consciousness because it can be uncomfortable to do so. And there's a word that I want to use today in reference to the behaviors and the things that we turn to in order to just distract and avoid. And the word that I want to use today is the word medicate. But I want to be very clear when I use that word, what I'm not saying. What I'm not saying is that medication is bad. Absolutely not saying that. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with modern medicine, anything inherently wrong. See, I look at my life and I look at myself as someone who is probably saved many times by modern medicine. I was had a lot of health problems growing up as a child, and I think if you would have transported me 10,000 years ago to the hunter-gatherer world, I probably would have been left behind by my tribe. So I'm grateful, so grateful for modern medicine. But we all know that just in our modern world, through all the different things and technologies and things that are available to us, there are ways that we medicate, right? And so whatever we're talking about, whether it's modern medicine, whether it's technology, whatever it is, there are things in the world that for one person, it may have saved their life. And for another person, the very same thing might be an escape. And the point that I want to make today is it's not the thing or the behavior in and of itself. It's the function. It's the way that that thing functions in our lives. I'll give you an example. Something like alcohol can be incredibly destructive for one person, and it can be not that big of a deal for another person because everyone is unique. The problem really happens when we demonize a particular behavior. We actually stop being reflective of how that behavior is functioning in our lives. So when we use that word medicate, I really just want you to think about, for you specifically, what are the things in your life that you know that you lean into in order to escape the feelings, in order to avoid the uncomfortability, in order to distract yourself from a moment that you don't necessarily want to be in order to numb out, and ultimately in order to get out of the present. And you might think, oh, this isn't that pleasant of a conversation to be having. But here's the deal, friends. If we want to talk about thriving, I think it's really important that to start out, we address the obstacles, the things that often can stand in the way of us thriving. And when I look at my own life, something that I feel that I'm definitely working on and trying to improve, but it feels like an uphill battle, is my relationship with technology. In particular, my relationship with my phone. It feels like the world has really transformed, not all that long ago, into a world that really seems to be increasingly dominated by phones and by the technology and the internet, and the way that it's really now with us at all times of the day. And if you are wondering, how does this actually affect our daily lives? I'll give you an example. How many of us have been out to lunch with a friend and they stand up and go to use the restroom, and you're left alone at the table, and your impulse is to pull out your phone and just do something, right? And sometimes you're just distracting yourself because you're bored. Sometimes you're thinking like, I don't want people to think I'm just sitting here. Like, I need to be looking at something, right? And you think, wow, it wasn't that long ago that we didn't have these phones and that we just had to sit there, right? But now the idea of just someone sitting at a table, it's like, what are they thinking about? Are they insane? What's going on? How do they just sit there, And it's really this jarring shift that's happened in a fairly short amount of time. And so it's important for us to look at our relationship. And again, phones are not inherently bad. They've also added and saved lives and added to our lives in these different ways. So it's important, again, not to demonize the thing itself, but understand what's our relationship to it. There are plenty of things that we need to evaluate our relationship to, even things that we wouldn't naturally expect. For example, think about religion. Sometimes even something like religion can be a way that we medicate our fears and our anxieties and our worries without actually dealing with them. How many of us have been a part of a form of religion that in a way actually fueled this addiction to certainty? That instead of dealing with hard questions, instead of dealing with difficult human emotions and who we actually were, we were given easy answers and simple understandings that actually allowed us to avoid really drilling into who we are as human beings. So even something like religion can be a mechanism of avoidance. There are even things that are generally healthy and good for us that we can still be using as a distraction. Like, I'm all for physical fitness, and I think it's a great thing. But there are even people, how many of you know these people? There are even people that use fitness as a way of distracting from like deeper emotional realities. I'll give you an example. I see on social media all the time people who are like, oh, I had a great session at the gym. The gym is my therapy. And I'm thinking like, but you could also maybe go to therapy too. That might help. There's only, your barbells aren't going to help fix your family issues, There's only so much that you can do there. Anything, friends, anything good or bad or neutral, it can be a mechanism of avoidance for us. It can be a way that we medicate. And I think that the thing we are most addicted to, more than anything else, is our thoughts. Our thoughts of the past, our thoughts of the future. Now, see, planning for the future can be good. Reflecting on the past can be good. But so often we engage with the past and we engage with the future in such a way that it pulls us out of the present. Or we are projecting the past or we are projecting the future onto the present. When we bring our expectations, our worries, our anxieties into the present. How many of us can relate to this on some level? See, life, it's going to throw at us things that we're going to want to escape. It's going to be full of encounters and triggers and challenges, and our brain is naturally going to experience a chemical reaction where we're going to want to get out of that moment in one way or another: fight, flight, or freeze. And see, our ancestors, the ones who actually developed these mechanisms, they had the right idea that when they experienced a threat, they're like, let's get out of here, let's escape. When our ancestors saw a rustling in the bushes, the ones that survived were the ones that were like, I'm not going to investigate this. I don't want to go in there, And I'm glad that I inherited that from them. If I hear a rustling in the bushes, especially when I'm hiking here in Arizona, I'm gone. I'm out of there. But here and now in the modern world, we face a very different set of threats, most of which are emotional, psychological, even spiritual. The same is true, though, of childhood. In childhood, we had the right idea when we were trying to escape, because in childhood, many of us had experiences that maybe were too complex or too difficult or too intense for us to fully process as a child, and so we chose to escape and to avoid and to distract. But now we are in a position as the adult version of ourselves to process the things that we couldn't as children. So maybe what was the right idea in childhood is now something that we can move past and transcend. See, when we are living in survival, we get stuck in a cycle where we experience uncomfortable emotions, maybe situations that trigger feelings from our past, and our first impulse is to go as quickly as possible back to comfort, using whatever mechanisms or medicating in whatever way works for us. But the issue there is that it pulls us out of the present, and anything that we're using in that way, all it does is scratch the surface. It doesn't give us an opportunity to deal with the things that are much deeper. The French philosopher Blaise Pascale said this: all of humanity's problems stems from man's inability to sit in a quiet room or sit quietly in a room alone. And I know that this sounds a little hyperbolic and dramatic, but at the same time, we look around at our world today and we see the difficulty that we have at times in just being with ourselves, in just sitting with who we are and how we feel moment to moment. We've probably all heard a version of that idea that, when you're traveling, the hard part of traveling is that wherever you go, there you are, right? You bring you with you. And you bring with you all your triggers and all sort of those inner booby traps of the soul, right? But we are so unconscious to those things. And in that sense, it does feel that it might be true that our ability to actually be with ourselves is related to so many of the different problems that we see in our world. But I also want to be clear about something. The ways in which we medicate, the mechanisms that we avoid our feelings, they're actually not so much the problem itself as they are our attempts to solve that problem. I'll give you an example. When you get a cold, and you experience the symptoms of that cold, be it runny nose, headache, sore throat, those symptoms are not the problem. The virus didn't bring those symptoms in. Those symptoms are your body's way of trying to deal with the virus, your body's way of trying to fight the virus. The symptoms are actually, in a way, an attempt at a solution. And so maybe this helps shift your perspective, whether you have, something in your life or something in the life of someone you love. Maybe it's a compulsion or an addiction. It's not the root problem. It's actually an attempt at dealing with the problem, at trying to fix the problem, albeit often in ways that aren't really working. But the real problem that we all have is something that is usually deeper. And it's something unconscious, or it's something that we need to go down into our subconscious, and like Carl Jung says, to make conscious in order to actually find some kind of deeper path forward. When we medicate, we live on the surface, and ultimately the deeper thing that we need to address remains a mystery. But if we are willing to go deep, if we are willing to have the courage to do that, that is when we experience something that I would maybe label today as actual deep healing. And thrival is the work of healing. While survival, we are just medicating, just getting by. With thrival, we are experiencing deep healing. Now, the word that we derive medicine, medicate from is a Latin word medico, which means heal and cure. And yet, how often are the ways that we attempt to medicate our problems not truly healing or not truly curative? They feel temporary. And yet, true healing is actually something that takes time and can be uncomfortable. There's a rule of thumb that I try to follow when I think about what is going to be truly healing in my life, and that's this: be wary of quick fixes and be wary of instant gratification. See, often we turn to our friends at Amazon or Facebook or Netflix, right, for a little quick fix, for a little instant gratification. And it's nice, right? You want to shop for something, and it's usually there within the next day. You want to scroll on Facebook for a little bit and the dopamine hit is pretty quick, or you want to go on Netflix and you have any movie that you want to watch, an entire show, it's all right there for you. And again, these things are not inherently good or bad. They've been used for good, they've been used for bad. But what tends to happen when we rely on them in a certain way is that we delay the opportunity for a more healing work in our lives. See, when these problems go unaddressed, our strategies to avoid feeling them tend to increase, they tend to evolve, they tend to become more complex, and at times this can take over our whole lives. The author Michael Singer wrote this book, The Untethered Soul, which I know some of you have read, and in that book, he has this wonderful metaphor about the inner thorn, and he has a conversation with Oprah in which he goes a little bit more into what he's talking about with the inner thorn.
My other favorite chapter of my new favorite book, The Untethered Soul, is removing your inner thorn. We all have them, right?
Yes, we do.
Do you still have some thorns?
Of course.
You do? Okay. The spiritual journey is about constant transformation. So you were saying, imagine, can you just do this for our audience? That whole passage on imagining you have a thorn in your arm that directly touches a nerve. Can you do that?
So the analogy we were using is if you had a thorn that was touching directly to a nerve so much so that anything that touched it caused pain inside of you. So if you walked, to walk through the woods and the leaf touched it, you weren't able to walk. If you were trying to interact with people, it caused a disturbance. And the key point of it is you have two choices. One is you can either try to avoid everything in your life that touches that thorn,
right,
or you can do this amazing alternative, which is take it out, all right? If you try to avoid it, you will be avoiding it for your entire life. It will go on
constantly. Which is what we're all doing, right?
Yes, it is.
We're all doing. We got our thorns in, and we don't want anybody to touch them.
Yes.
And if they touch them and they irritate our little thorn, we're upset because you shouldn't have touched my thorn.
Yes.
That's the whole.
And that's the game that we play is how do I build a life that avoids touching all this stuff that happened to me that I can't handle. When they happened, I couldn't handle it. And now it's caused all these soft spots inside of me.
Thorns.
Thorns. So I need to create a life, train everybody around me, all right, so they don't ever touch
Avoid my thorn.
You don't touch.
Some people even say that. Don't you go there with me.
That's
yeah,
right.
yeah,
Exactly
yeah.
right. The alternative is to understand you can remove that thorn inside of you the same as you can remove it outside. And if you remove it, you will never have to think about it again, and you can start to enjoy your entire life. And that is spirituality.
That is spirituality. Now, how do you know what your thorn is?
Disturbance tells you. Just like pain happens when you hit the thorn outside,
yes,
disturbance happens inside.
Because it's never what is actually happening.
Right.
It's what is happening is irritating your thorn.
It was put in there before.
That's
very good.
That's good. That's
very
good.
Now, this idea of simply removing the thorn, we know that sometimes it can be more complex than that. But I think what he's alluding to is this almost an orientation, a way of either shifting and looking for the solution to be avoidance or actually looking inward. Can we do the work on ourselves to try to remove that thorn? See, survival is reactive. Survival is, I don't like how I feel. I don't like the way that thorn is getting pressed, so I'm going to avoid it. Thrival is proactive. It says, I don't like how I feel, and I notice that the thorn is being pressed. Let me dig in. Let me be curious about what's going on there in service of greater healing. See, the act and the process and the practice of removing the thorn is more painful in the short term, no doubt, but it's healthier in the long term. And keeping it in feels a lot more comfortable in the short term. But think about all that it prevents us from experiencing in the long term. See, healing is slow. Healing is vulnerable. Healing invites us to show up again and again, whether that be to community, whether that be to our spiritual practices, whether that be to therapy, actual therapy, or things that function as therapy in your life, being in nature, hobbies. This is the work of healing, showing up patiently, consistently to these things. Now, there is an obstacle that we all face in doing this work. And it's the fact that really our society actually profits from the ways and the methods that we use to cover our thorns. If we look around, we see a world where the default is to protect our thorns, and society is making money from this. And it can be incredibly countercultural to say, I actually want to do that deep inner work of healing. Why do you think for so long our world has been dismissive of things like holistic healing or an understanding of working on ourselves and healing our bodies that incorporates the mind, the body, and the soul? Krishnamurti was a spiritual teacher at the turn of the century, and he said this: it is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. Thank you so much. No. I'm like, I didn't write that, but that was almost 100 years ago now. But I think in a lot of ways he is not simply referring to the physical. I think in more of a sense he's referring to the spiritual unhealth of our world. And he wrote this, again, in a time that he hadn't even seen a lot of the technology and a lot of the things that we have in our world today. And one aspect of this unhealthy society that I think Krishnamurti is referring to is how we don't often recognize in this type of world, we don't recognize that everything we see, everything that we hear, the ways in which we communicate, the ways in which we don't communicate, all of these things affect us. All of these things are part of who we become. See, our doctors, they'll occasionally ask us, oh, how's your diet? And of course, they're referring to physical, material. They're referring to what do you eat, right? How rare is it, if ever, that someone asks, how is your spiritual diet? What food for the soul are you taking in consistently on a daily basis? Because just like physical food, not all spiritual food is healthy, and not all spiritual food is good for us. And yet we rarely, if ever, question the function and the role of the things that we take in our lives. I'll give you an example. How many of us have noticed, especially in the last decade or so, maybe a couple of decades, a shift in the news? That the news seems to lean into fear, and it seems to enjoy outrage, and it seems to profit from division. And see, I think what the news and what the companies and the people who run these things, what they found is that they can actually drive engagement and increase viewership, which of course translates to more money, through negative emotion rather than positive emotion. And so it's no wonder that the news skews negative. And yet what we don't often think about is the fact that we are digesting all of this. Everything that we take in, all the news that we watch, we are digesting. Now, I understand, look, it's an election year, and I understand that it can feel responsible to be paying attention to what's going on in the world. I get that. There's so many things happening, and it can feel really, really responsible. But how much information are we taking in where we can look at it and say, well, knowing this doesn't really change anything about my direct actions in my life? See, here's the reality. We probably all know right now who we're going to vote for, right? And all the news that we take in and all the outrage that we experience about things that are going to happen over the next handful of months, it's stuff that we're actually digesting and consuming, and it becomes part of our spiritual diet. Think about friendships. How many of us have had a friend where, if we're being honest, when we talk to that friend, it feels like all the energy gets sucked out of the room? And you're like, I don't know if this is actually feeding me. And the opposite is true. Sometimes we have friends that are like spiritual vitamins. But regardless, you know that old saying, you essentially become the average of the 5 friends that you see the most. Our relationships, like anything else, are a part of our spiritual diet. And we need to be thoughtful about how these things are contributing. There are things in our life that are somewhat neutral, and then we just need to be critical about what role is this thing playing in my life. I'll give you an example from my life. Reality TV, okay, I know some of you are like, that's poison. There have been times in my life where, and I think about my relationship, and there have been times in with me and Olivia where sometimes watching reality TV has been actually a way for us to connect. And there have been other times where watching reality TV is a way for us to avoid and distract how we're feeling. The same thing can have multiple outcomes depending on the way that we are interacting with it. But make no mistake, everything we see, everything we hear, everything we interact with, it's all part and it all contributes to our spiritual health. Another way of looking at this is what author James Clear says: every action you take is a vote for the type of person you wish to become. Every choice is a part of our spiritual health. And this is what we are talking about when we talk about living mindfully, living consciously, living with intent. What we are saying is, are we aware and are we conscious of the effect of the outcome of our choices, or are we just making choices without really considering what they mean for our lives? And the thing about this modern world that we live in is that today, if we don't choose what we value, it will be chosen for us. If we don't choose how we're going to spend our time, if we don't choose where we're going to give our attention, it's going to be chosen for us because, again, in our changing world and the way that our media has evolved and technology has evolved, it seems to be getting more aggressive, and we need to be more intentional than ever about deciding for ourselves what kind of lives we want to lead. And the reality is that technology and the internet, it's not going anywhere. So trying to just escape it and avoid it isn't as practical as asking ourselves, how are we going to coexist and live with it? How are we going to renegotiate our relationship to it? I just want to kind of wrap up today with a couple more thoughts on this topic. And really, I want to address something that I think maybe is coming up for us when we have this conversation about what are these things doing in our lives? Because for a lot of us, we grew up in a system in which we were told, particularly within religion, that there is a behavior and it is either sinful or not sinful. And that was the basic black and white frame that we were given. The problem with this frame is that it actually leads us away from being reflective about how these things are functioning in our lives. If we say, oh, this thing is either inherently good or bad, we don't ask any questions about what this thing is doing in our lives. And we all know that saying, don't do that to a child doesn't really have much effect, right? Just like it can often have the reverse effect. They've found in studies that abstinence-only education tends to be completely 100% ineffective. And when my dog steals my socks and I tell her, hey, like, no, don't do that, she thinks we're playing and she runs away. Here's the thing, friends. All behaviors, all things, they live on a spectrum. And it's important for us to be critical about what is holding you back from living and thriving in the fullest way. Not simply demonizing something as it is. Paracelsus was a Swiss physician. Swiss? That's a new country. The Swiss are very great dental hygiene with the Swiss, you know. Paracelsus was a Swiss physician and philosopher, and he said this: Sola, dosis, facit, venenum. Now, of course, you can all rely on your high school Latin and tell me what that means, correct? What this actually means, and it's a very important phrase in the medical world and in toxicology, is this: only the dose makes the poison. You may have heard it this way: the difference between medicine and poison is in the dose. And what's being said here is that it's not the thing itself, it's the context of the thing and the way it's being used. It's the effect and how it's being used in our lives. In 1997, a 14-year-old student named Nathan Zahner was working on a science project called How Gullible Are We? And in this science project, what he did is he started a very real petition to ban the chemical dihydrogen monoxide. And so what he did was he went around to people and he said all true things, all facts. He said dihydrogen monoxide is also known as hydroxyl acid. It causes incredible amounts of erosion. It's very deadly, and it's found in nearly all of the junk foods that we consume. Now, for any of you who has heard anything about this before, what you might be in on is that dihydrogen monoxide is another name for water. And everything that he said about water is true. Water is also known as hydroxyl acid. Water causes a lot of erosion. Water can be deadly, right? Anyone who's spent any time in the ocean knows water is dangerous, right? And of course water is found in all of our junk foods because it's found in all of our foods. So nothing he was saying was untrue. But what he proved is that it's all about context. It's all about the way in which we understand the thing. See, water can be dangerous. Water can be essential. And yet it's all about how are we using it. When we demonize the behavior, when we demonize the thing itself, we actually stop being reflective and we stop taking accountability of how that thing is interacting in our lives. The last thought today is this. There are no healers, okay? There are no healers. See, anyone who is engaged in some kind of truly healing work in a healthy way would say this. There is no one outside of you that can fix you, right? There is no one outside of you that can do the healing work for you. What they can do is hold space for you to do that healing work for yourself. But make no mistake, friends, that work is yours. So whether we're demonizing a behavior or we're glorifying, I'm having a day. To glorify. When we are we are demonizing healers. Oh my goodness. Okay. I was at the Festival of Books all day yesterday, and then I came in today, and then we're having the electrical issue, and then now I'm up here. And my mind is swirling, and it's coming back. All right, here we go. 1, 2, 3. All right. Whether we demonize behaviors, substances, or we glorify healers, at the end of the day, these things are projecting out and they're pushing out this understanding that all healing is found within. So Aldea, we are the ones that are responsible to recognize, are we medicating? Are we healing? Every day, we choose our spiritual diet. So may we choose presence. May we choose to dig into what's in front of us, even when it's uncomfortable, because this, friends, this is the path of healing and the path of thrival.